In March of 2017, a major event happened. AMD released the first generation of Ryzen processor, and with that, of course, Zen actually debuted. Now, this was a huge event in the industry because, well, quite frankly, up until that point, it had been a one-horse race for x86 processors. AMD in the past had competed favorably with Intel with processors such as the early Athlons, Bartons, and even Athlon 64, but later Intel processors had simply just outperformed AMD, particularly when it comes to certain tasks such as gaming. And while the first generation of Ryzen, as well as its kind of successor Zen Plus, also known as Ryzen 2000, didn't outperform Intel in terms of gaming, it did mean that AMD were firmly ahead in terms of the core count. It was very performant still in gaming, pretty damn good, especially after some BIOS updates, and really did mean that Intel had to be forced, essentially, to release Coffee Lake earlier than what it had wanted to. This basically meant that mainstream Intel processors went from 4 cores / 8 threads at the highest end SKUs up to, of course, 6 cores, 12 threads with the 8700K. And AMD was still doing great in productivity tasks, and then future AMD processors, particularly Zen 2 onwards, have really just done absolutely amazing against Intel. But one thing is absolutely for sure, AMD's release schedule for Zen has been absolutely relentless. And honestly, it just hasn't missed. Zen 2, Zen 3, Zen 4, and as you probably guessed from the video title, Zen 5 is now shaping up to be an absolute monster of a processor. And in this video, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about this. Zen 5 is going to be found, of course, in servers, laptops, and for the majority of my audience anyway, I suspect you're probably going to be interested in Granite Ridge, which of course will be on AM5, also known as the desktop. Now, frankly, I've heard a dizzying number of IPC and performance claims with the next generation of Ryzen processors. In this video, I really want to talk to you guys about some things I've been hearing from some sources, particularly when it comes to bandwidth constraints, and try to make some sense of things. Now, I do suspect that we're going to get some pretty damn solid information, probably from leaks from AMD's partners over the next couple of months. But until then, I really want to talk to you guys about this because, quite frankly, Zen 5 is one of those products that really does start to grip my imagination. Sometimes certain products like RDNA 2 has done it in the past, RTX 20 did as well when we were starting to go into the ray tracing era, and I will be super curious to find out what actually happens with Zen 5. Well, let's just get right into it, shall we? This is a paid partnership with BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a great way to take your first steps to improving your mental health with a service which offers 100% online therapy. Life is certainly capable of throwing you some curveballs, but it doesn't mean that you need to deal with them alone. With the right support with a good therapist, you can be given the tools to really help to better your situation and deal with things as they come. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a major situation that you're dealing with, such as say the death of a loved one or severe depression. Sometimes you may just need that little bit of support or perhaps advice to get you through a situation. BetterHelp is a 100% online service, so when you're signing up, you will be asked a few questions, and then after a couple of days, you'll be matched with a 100% credentialed therapist. You can find the link to BetterHelp in the video description or the pinned comment down below. And not only, of course, will you help support the channel, but you will also be given 10% off your first month of therapy. And don't worry if the matched therapist isn't a great fit for you, perhaps you just don't gel quite well together, then you can switch to a different therapist 100% free, no cost to yourself. You don't need to be defined by mental health issues that you're dealing with, and you can certainly learn to heal and thrive. With BetterHelp, you have therapists who will be able to help you with anxiety, depression, loss of a loved one, stress, and perhaps if you're just feeling a little bit anxious, or maybe you just need someone to talk to if you're going through a tough time. So again, if you click the link in the video description, or you can find the pinned comment, or you can go to betterhelp.com/redgaming, you can save 10% off, and you can take the first steps to improving your mental health. So then, right off the bat, I want to stress that I'm going to be focusing primarily on Granite Ridge for this video, and I also don't want to delve too deeply into the architecture. I think Granite Ridge is going to be of much more interest to the majority of the viewers, although I will touch a little bit on Turin as well. But as for the architecture, well, we've gone into it extensively across several videos at this point, so although I will touch on it kind of here or there, ultimately speaking, I think it's best for us to focus mostly on clock speeds and, of course, the IPC. It's worth noting, though, and this is well-known information at this point, given lots of leaks, that 16 cores, 32 threads is still going to be retained for Zen 5. So there's no difference there. They're not increasing the core count. And of course they will also release the X3D chips as well. So what about the clock frequency? Well, basically I've been given a lot of reports from sources regarding the clock frequency targets, but ultimately speaking, there's not a huge difference from one report to another. Several sources have told me that the clock frequencies for Granite Ridge will have a small regression versus the previous generation Ryzen chips, and others are telling me there's going to be a slight bump. One source told me around 5.85 GHz, another told me just over 6 GHz, but this could be Fmax speeds and potentially also single core, lightly threaded workloads, and it becomes very difficult to know exactly what clock frequencies you're going to hit, because of course different workloads can have huge differences as well, not to mention the fact that what's the state of the ES sample, what was the setup of the system, for example PBO and that type of stuff. It's very difficult, but ultimately speaking, there's also the reason that TSMC are going to be using their 4nm process for the Granite Ridge processors, and some Zen 5 CPUs of course do benefit from the 3nm process, but they're like Turing dense, for example. So the 4nm process is basically a refinement of the 5nm process, so you can only expect so much, particularly given the fact that the actual cores themselves are a lot denser and there are some big architectural improvements from one generation to another. Now, again, I've spoken about this pretty exhaustively in the past, but basically speaking, there is a lot of changes that we're going to see for Zen 5. It's going to be very interesting, to be honest, when we get official disclosures across the entire thing. With this said, there is some evidence, courtesy of a recent shipping manifest that's emerged, that TDP for certain has actually increased. One example we've seen is an 8-core AM5 CPU from, of course, the Zen 5 lineup being listed as 170 watts. This is actually up from 105 watts of the Zen 4 based equivalent. Now, naturally, you could put this down to, let's say, a mistake that is perhaps from a typo, or maybe simply because these are not final production samples and so things could change for retail. But it's also very possible that AMD have made some changes, and therefore some of the confusion we've seen regarding the clocks is because AMD are bumping up the juice for certain SKUs. Now, this is definitely speculation on my part, but perhaps also the boosting behavior of Zen 5 Ryzen's Granite Ridge is also different with higher core counts as well. It'll be very interesting to see what actually ends up happening here, because again, there is a little bit of confusion, and as much as I'm very curious about the actual IPC and some of the other stuff we're discussing, such as memory bandwidth, I will be very curious to see how the boosting behavior differs from different workloads. So then, let's get to the real nitty-gritty, which is IPC. Again, clock frequencies, we can't really expect those to increase too much, so IPC is the major reason, of course, that we're going to see people want to upgrade from one generation to another. And, well, honestly, there have been a lot of numbers that I've been given in terms of IPC, and a lot of numbers that have been touted or guessed online. Now, I have heard some very, very high numbers in terms of IPC, and I'll speak about them in just a second, but personally speaking, I am going to be essentially hoping for 20% average, and that's kind of what I'm telling myself. I have heard from very good sources that it could well be more than that, and again, I'll get into them in just a second. But 15 to 20% has been typically the historical average that AMD have increased Zen by. Let's take Zen to Zen Plus out of the equation, because obviously that was a small refresh with a couple of small changes here or there with the caches. So yeah, I think 15 to 20% has been pretty historical. There have been some bigger improvements AMD have done in the past with like the Athlon chips. I think was absolutely ridiculous. They actually catapulted past Pentium 3 even. We saw, of course, the, well, when they went from like Bulldozer and all those CPUs, which were, you know, they were decent, I suppose, for budget. And then, of course, the first generation of Ryzen, I think the original target was something like 40% IPC, and they hit like 52. So, you know, again, there's certainly a lot of precedent that you can get a ridiculous jump in performance. And this is where I want to talk to you guys about now. So, previously I did release a video from a source, and that source is a very good one, that they'd been hearing from multiple people within the industry that low 30% IPC was being touted for a Zen 5 CPU. This was under a mixed workload with a couple of different popular benchmarks. After I put that video out, I was then contacted by another source. They'd actually been radio silent for months, like absolute multiple months, but in the past they had been really good, but again, they just had been really radio silent. They hadn't actually answered any messages that I'd given them. But in brief, they essentially confirmed the numbers that I'd given in that video, which again was around 30-ish%, but they also added that the numbers were actually based on some older information dating back to Q4 last year, so that's 2023 if you're watching this a couple of years time, and produced using the B0 silicon. Since then, AMD have apparently done a respin. I've been told this by a couple of people, and so numbers now may have improved a little bit again as well, because you also have improvements in the software version. So with that said, there has been some information that has, of course, been pretty much confirmed by AMD. They have, in slides, official slides, said that there's going to be a ground-up redesign, there's going to be multiple improvements that they have mentioned officially, but there have been also some reports that we're going to see up to 2x performance increase in over Zen 4 in AVX 512. This is actually causing some people to be concerned, because mining of QBIC is actually quite profitable on Zen 4, funnily enough. So obviously if you get double the performance on Zen 5, that's going to be, well, let's just say interesting. Now, more recently, I've had yet more people tell me that 30% IPC gains are likely, which of course would be absolutely incredible. Now, we do know that there have been improvements to the coders and just, well, about everything. Again, I've covered this more exhaustively in the past, but even some patents even slipped under the radar, or at least mine. Maybe it's common knowledge, but I certainly didn't see it. Back in like 2022, there was a title of one patent which had processor with multiple fetch and decode pipelines, and also processor with multiple op cache pipelines, and again you can see them on screen. Now this seems of course to be Zen 5 based, because, well, it's not like AMD are putting a patent out for like an SSD with these names, let's just be honest. So yeah, I think we can just say, well, it's probably going to be Zen 5, because previous generations of Zen just don't make sense, and obviously it's not like they're gonna have a patent out at this stage for like Zen 7 or something like that. So yeah. Anyway, it's going to be interesting to see official disclosures, of course, from AMD regarding Zen 5, but while all of that does sound very positive, I am hearing that the performance on Granite Ridge is often being significantly hampered by bandwidth. Now, basically, the IOD seems to be essentially identical from the previous generation, i.e. Zen 4. There are some modest improvements I'm hearing to nudge the memory clocks, but basically workloads will always differ, of course, and how much they tax memory. It's going to be like the number of threads that's loaded, what type of work, and so on and so on. But basically, in a lot of workloads, it seems that the performance, at least according to these sources, is essentially being strangled by lack of RAM. Now, this may not be the case, of course, for Turing, because, well, it's a completely different thing, and, well, it doesn't have dual memory channels to contend with. It obviously has a couple more memory channels than just 2. But it's going to be very interesting, because this could potentially mean that it's the case of like the body is willing, but the mind is willing, but the body isn't able. Or in this case, the chip is technically able, but the bandwidth just can't feed the cores. Now, it's worth pointing out, of course, that there will be Vcache variants which launch later, but obviously Vcache doesn't hold gigabytes of data, which is of course the job of the DDR5 memory. Therefore, Vcache is probably going to help in certain applications, assuming, of course, again, this information is true, but it also isn't going to help in every situation. It's certainly not going to be a silver bullet. Now, I have, on the other hand, while I've had multiple sources tell me 30% plus does seem quite likely, I've also had some sources absolutely convinced And to be fair, again, they've been pretty accurate that 15 to 20% is the average that they are hearing, and they do not believe this is because of bandwidth, but simply because of architectural goals. Basically, AMD were essentially designing Zen 5 to be, let's say, 15 to 20% improvement over Zen 4, and well, that's all there is to it. I've spoken to a lot of sources about this, and I even asked some sources who told me the higher numbers, well, why are other people telling me the lower numbers, because this is really bloody confusing. And, well, basically the pushback I got is that, in one case, someone basically told me that AMD literally knew slides would leak, and so there's potentially sandbagging going on. Or another source told me it was bandwidth constraints. Now, I don't really know whether the sandbagging theory is true or not, but I will add that combating leaks is now becoming a really big part of AMD, Nvidia, Intel, you know, like all of these companies. Like, there's been a recent tweet by Tom Henderson where he basically said that with all of the PlayStation 5 Pro leaks, because obviously those documents came out, and now like Digital Foundry and himself, and yeah, it's just like there have been so many parts of the documents now that have leaked. Sony just kind of said, yeah, well, at this point, we're going to tell studios the bare minimum, and we're basically going to strictly control things. And that's actually going to kind of suck, by the way, for the PS5 Pro as a slight aside, because it could mean that, the PS6 onwards, because it could mean that developers just don't get as much time with the hardware before, you know, things launch. But that's, you know, that's a slightly different topic. So it's very possible that Epic will actually differ significantly in terms of gains, because one, again, the higher TDP, but B, there's a lot more bandwidth. Now, generally speaking, I think Zen 5 is going to be absolutely amazing, but the performance gains are still difficult to pin down. And again, even if a specific number is correct, there's always the question of, is it across several benchmarks? Is it single thread? Is it multi-thread? What is the platform? Again, is it, let's say, well, desktop? Is it server? If it is server, which specific server? And so on and so on. It becomes a very interesting question. Also, is it truly IPC, or does it also include the clock frequency as well? Now, I have heard someone tell me, in fact, a couple of people tell me, that the 30% number is for integer, but they are from server samples, so client could end up being lower than that. But it's going to honestly be absolutely intriguing to see what AMD does as we go forward. Of course, perhaps this is also dependent upon the SKU, based on what we'd already spoken about earlier regarding the Zen 5 shipping manifests. Frankly, I will be super interested to see what Zen 5 as well as Zen 6 does bring to the table. Speaking just briefly on Zen 6, as I've covered this kind of extensively in another video, well, maybe a month or so back, Zen 6 really does seem like it is an evolution of sorts of Zen 5. Basically, it takes a lot of the principles that Zen 5 has brought to the table, such as some of the stuff we've discussed here, such as the wider, architecture and all of that stuff. But what it does do is solve a lot of the bandwidth constraints, and it does this with a lot of advanced packaging. Early on with Zen 6 leaks, I had said that it's kind of like N31 in that respect in terms of the packaging, but I think it's fairer to say in reality that it's more like Sarlacc, aka the Strix Point Halo SKUs. I've been told that the packaging is kind of like Info R, that's Info-R for FYI. And honestly, I think that Zen 6 will be interesting, because while IPC gains are probably going to be less in terms of the actual architecture, in terms of what's changed from Zen 5 to Zen 6 in terms of the FP units or whatever, I think actual IPC gains could be pretty performant indeed, simply because, well, there's just more data that can be fed to the CPU cores, and as you know, the convoy with computer architectures typically goes as fast as the slowest ship. Basically, if the, cores are just like, oh look, there's some data, that's not great. So it's going to be very interesting to see what AMD does bring to the fray over the next couple of generations, because the reality is Intel is certainly not going to be sitting on its hands. I will be fascinated, honestly, to see how the benchmarks for Arrow Lake and future Intel architectures actually shape up, especially because, of course, Arrow Lake is going bye-bye to hyper-threading for the performance cores. I've heard that there will be an Arrow Lake refresh as well, which is probably going to be 32 E-cores, so the E-core spam is certainly going to be alive. But anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'll see you soon, guys. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.